So welcome to today's astrobiology seminar. Today we have a double bill and two of our faculty from UW. So we'll start with Michelle Koutnik. She's a research associate professor in Earth and Space Sciences, and she's going to tell us about old ice on Earth and Mars. And then at the half-hour mark, we'll change over to Baptiste Journo, who's a research assistant professor in Earth and Space Sciences. And he will tell us something about icy moons. So anyway, that's today's treat. So Michelle, take it away.
Thanks, David. Thanks. It's great to be here. Nice to see you all. Yeah, this talk will be sort of an introduction to work that I'm part of and things I've been thinking about over the years, and also thinking of the potential and things to come from these two different but projects that have some synergies. So there are many people that have been involved in this work, especially for the Center for Oldest Ice Exploration and all of the affiliations that you see along the side here. This is a new National Science Foundation center, and we're starting our third year in September. And so, yeah, we've got some things underway, but also some things to come. So I'll introduce that and share about it. And Dale is also involved here. And so, yeah, great. So bringing together Earth and Mars, I wanted to start by setting up sort of some different goals, but also some parallels that come in when thinking about old ice in these planetary bodies. So on Earth, there are a number of international efforts going on right now to recover old ice cores and samples. And I'll talk more about what old means, but in particular, targeting more than million-year-old ice, and in some cases, multi-million-year-old ice. And on Mars, there's a recognition that ice is a critical archive of past climate. How to access it is more difficult, but it's also a critical resource for future missions. So thinking of how science pairs with the resource availability of near surface or surface ice is an important component of future science on Mars. And astrobiologically, on Earth, the ice environments are microbial habitats, both under the ice and within the ice. And the ice cores that are recovered, especially from Antarctica, the deep ice cores, provide information about the relationship between air temperature and greenhouse gas concentrations going back very far back in time. And on Mars, there's a parallel there where the subglacial environments may contain liquid water, if not today, perhaps in the past. And the ice may preserve microorganisms or be used to assess biogeochemical processes and habitats at different times in the past. So there's a habitat consideration, a water consideration, and then an archive consideration with ice. And so why old ice on Earth? Why are we targeting any locations that may contain really old ice? So we have found more than 1 million-year-old ice in a few locations in Antarctica, and these are discrete samples. And theoretically, it should be possible that portions of the near the base of the East Antarctic ice sheet do preserve very old, more than 1 million-year-old ice that could be recovered in a continuous record. So right now we just have some discrete samples, but we're also after locations that we may be able to recover a more continuous record. And these are really unique archives, which I'll talk a little bit more about, providing direct information about past atmospheric conditions. And on Mars, we do know that ice that's a few million years to hundreds of millions of years old exists in the mid-latitudes and also in the north and south poles, some directly at the surface and some buried beneath sort of an overburden layer in the subsurface or in the ground. And ice may contain information about past climate, past life, past geology, and these are all major pillars of Mars exploration. So ice is sort of a center target of a lot of questions. And this mid-latitude ice that's not at the surface but buried in the near subsurface is a potential resource for future crewed missions. Okay, so I'll start talking primarily about the earthwork, the work in Antarctica. And some of you may have already heard about this because this has been ongoing and there's a big international effort through different countries looking for locations that may have this more than million-year-old ice. And a European team has started drilling at a location near Dome C called Little Dome C. And based on the size of these drilling regions of interest, people are sort of searching different areas, primarily on domes and primarily near to where they have some logistical access. And the US effort through this recently funded Science and Technology Center called Koldex is looking at a patch of East Antarctica in particular, in this area here going between South Pole and Dome A. And again, this is looking for locations that might have a continuous record of more than million-year-old ice. But it's hard to find this ice. The preservation of old ice will be rare. I'll talk a little bit more about that, but a big challenge is just that you can have melting at the base of the ice sheet, so you don't preserve the oldest record there on long periods of time. Recovering it is logistically challenging. So the fact that multiple countries are going after this old ice in Antarctica is actually a really good thing. If we have multiple deep cores, this will undoubtedly help an interpretation of that core once some of them are recovered. And it's a pretty big collaboration to cite the locations where you may have this ice, try to confirm it all in advance if you can, that it's likely to be there, and then go drill and then analyze the ice. Okay. And just to say a little bit about ice cores that we do have. So we do have ice cores from Antarctica that go back about 800,000 years. Some of you may have seen these records. And this is a long record, but there's some key questions that we have about the Earth system that extend past this mid-Pleistocene transition around 800,000 to 1.2 million years ago in particular, that if we had an ice core record spanning that would greatly assist in trying to understand controls on the climate system during that time and dipping back into previous warm periods. Yeah, so this is a major priority, and the continuous record is something pretty distinct out of this, but also blue ice cores have been collected in discrete samples in areas where the ice from deep in the ice sheet is kind of brought up closer to the surface near the margins. And there's a particular dynamic regime that leads to that, but some samples have been collected and sort of dated to be back in multi-million year range. So there's a separate effort looking for discrete samples in these blue ice areas, and then the interior East Antarctic work looking for a more continuous record. And a little bit more context on this is what we can get from the marine record. So from fossil foraminiferal shells, we have some constraints with error bars on past CO2 and a proxy for temperature going back millions of years. And we see a couple things in this record that lead to really fundamental questions about how the climate system works. One that we see is there's a general cooling over the past about 5 million years from the temperature proxy. And then you start to see larger climate oscillations over time, especially as you cross over from around 1 million years to the present. And as the climate cycles get bigger, they also get longer, going from this 40,000 year cycles to about 100,000 year cycles. And if you take that temperature record and kind of see what's happening with the proxy for the CO2, or the CO2 record that's here, there's more variability back in time. So it's hard to see the relationship that might be there, and there's larger uncertainties on some of the records coming out of the fossil record. So we do have, if we put the ice core record on top of this is the same plot, but with the ice core information added in the middle, from the continuous core going back 800,000 years at Dome C, and then some discrete samples that we have, we can start to fill in some temperature and CO2 information. But what we'd really like to have is that continuity across this transition, and look more at that relationship between temperature and CO2. So some of these really fundamental questions that having a continuous ice core record could start to get at are: what were the concentrations of CO2 good trend going back through into this previous warm period. What role do they play in global climate? And then why did the climate cycles and periodicity change from 40,000 to 100,000 year cycles after that point? Okay, so with that really kind of fundamental questioning behind it, Coldex was initiated as a large-scale collaboration, and this first phase, really the first 5 years, will be the exploration side of just where could we recover this old ice, especially in the interior, but also additional investigations in these blue ice areas near the margin. So this is a pretty idealized cartoon, but you can see so that the near margin sites are places where you have these topographic driven, you have ice flow being driven up by topography, and you have the old ice being closer to near the surface, but it's really not in any kind of continuous record. So it's very hard to put a continuous record out of that, but you can get discrete samples that are still valuable, and they're pretty accessible, and we know some places to go to collect more samples like that. But we don't really know where to go into the interior. So a lot of airborne radar and ground radar will come in the following years, and then also in situ probing with the thermal probe, the ice diver that Dale, Tim, and others are involved with, leading, and then eventually there will be drilling. So yeah, this first phase of exploration is where we're at now. And the radar, even just what we've gotten back from the field in the first airborne campaign happened the last Antarctic season. So kind of this year, we started to get data back in around March when all of it was processed and being made available. And we see, these are older data sets, but we can see structures like this in the new data. And so what we're looking for is, you know, ideally something where the layering is pretty simple and continuous, but we may not always get sites like that, since we're not only looking up high on the divides, we're looking at a location going off those domes towards South Pole. So we do see in some of the newer data unconformities. We hope to not see areas with freeze-on at the bed that would disturb the basal record. And yeah, any erosional surfaces we have to be careful of if we've lost continuity or significant continuity in the record. So a first step is really to look at the layer data that we get from airborne radar, combine that with models and other analyses to try and start to characterize on a large scale what we see in the internal structure. And so these geophysical data allow us to see into the ice. And this airborne campaign is what's been started, and ground-based campaigns will follow in subsequent years. And then in situ observations will follow from that, where the ice diver will be able to, having on board the ice diver system, will be able to image the layering structure within the ice sheet and be able to come up with an age scale and then also a temperature measurement at the base. So providing an in situ constraint at the scale of where we might consider to drill. Yeah, and all of this needs to come together in order for site selection. So that's a number of years down the line, but we're really building up towards that starting now once the new data come in. And just to say a little bit about the modeling side, that's a part that I'm more directly contributing to. We've had information from large-scale models for a number of years that old cold, so it's not melting at the bottom, and continuous ice could exist in at least a few locations. And if you can kind of see on this map, mostly showing this older model run because it's easy to look at patches where the models have identified ice could be, and these magenta triangles are domes, the different ice domes in Antarctica, and then in East Antarctica, and this is Lake Vostok, and South Pole is over here. And so typically they're at high elevation locations, but there's a lot of uncertainty in these models, in particular with the heat flow coming into the base of the ice sheet. That's a big unknown. So this is kind of a starting point, but we'll be developing more specific models for the target region that we're studying, and hopefully with better constraints coming from the new data sets. And yeah, more data is critical here because a lot of even the basic geometric data, seeing the ice bottom and getting a sense of the ice geometry hasn't been available at the area that we're targeting. And so we're applying these models at regional to local scale. And this is really an iterative process because, so what's been happening now, there's an airborne campaign. Now we have those data, and there will be another airborne campaign this coming Antarctic season. And we can use our models to sort of help inform where additional airborne data could be collected, but also in future years where the ground-based campaigns could go. So sort of refine from this hundreds of kilometer scale search area to tens of kilometer scale search areas, and then eventually down to the scale of the core that will be drilled. But with a particular emphasis on the basal temperature history, the flow paths of the ice, the age structure, and yeah, our priority is to come up with a distribution of candidate sites, the chance for the existence of old ice, and then something about the resolution that you might get at those sites, especially the age resolution as you get near to the very bottom. And you can see in this figure here, this color scale goes from 0 at the surface to 1.4 million years back in time at the bed. And the ice that we're most interested in, this is around Dome C, and this is not a site that we're considering right now, but the age structure is similar through the ice sheet where you get very old ice concentrated right near the bed. So the specific conditions at the bed really matter to whether or not you've preserved the ice you're interested in. So, okay, so that's an introduction to where we're at. And this is ongoing work that's really exciting. It's truly synchronizing technology development, field studies, modeling, and then a lot of people in a large scale center operation. So this has been, we're a couple years in, and hopefully we have this first phase of exploration and then a second phase that would involve drilling. So definitely stay tuned. Okay, so moving over to Mars, very quickly to shift our minds to this. Mars being about half the size of Earth by diameter, with a lower gravity and an atmosphere that's about 96% carbon dioxide and a low atmospheric pressure compared to Earth. So water ice. Yeah, we know water ice exists on the surface and the near subsurface, but I just wanted to spend a couple slides reviewing the distribution of that ice. And so at the North Pole, there's a large, primarily water ice deposit, and it's water ice exposed at the surface. There is a seasonal deposit of carbon dioxide ice in a portion of that, and that precipitates out every winter onto the whole surface of the North Polar layered deposits. The structure of that is there's a lot of water ice. There's about 2 kilometers of water ice, and underlying that about 1 kilometer of something called the basal unit, which has quite a bit of debris in it, but also ice. And it's, at least a few million years old, and the basal unit is likely much older. So it's a relatively recent ice deposit and water ice at the surface. In the south, there is a deposit that's buried. You can't see the full topographic extent of it, but it would be something like this. There's a carbon dioxide seasonal and residual cap that forms here. This is the residual carbon dioxide that stays all year. But there's quite a bit of ice, both water ice and also some buried carbon dioxide ice underneath this covering of dust that is across the South Pole. So there's also quite a bit of ice at the south, but currently most of it's sequestered from exchange with the atmosphere. And then these are profiles of the North again, and you can see really detailed layer structure, both in imagery and draped over topography, and then also in radar. And the layering can be continuous for hundreds of kilometers. So it's really an incredible archive there, both at the large scale, but then also at the fine scale and the sort of tens of centimeter scale of the detail that you can see. But we haven't really tapped into this as much as there might be potential for, largely being driven as from remote sensing data. So what really is the climate history archive there is a big open question. And there's also layers in the south that can be seen in imagery on the left panels that are high resolution imagery, and also in the radar. And there's some interesting structures here, kind of akin to what we see in our Eastern Arctic data sets with large scale unconformities. There's also some of that kind of structural form in the South Polar layer deposits on Mars. And there's also a lot of ice in the mid-latitudes and high latitudes. The ground ice in the photo here was found at the Phoenix landing site, just below the surface. And there's been some impact craters that have exposed into the surface at a number of different mid to high latitudes, showing that just under that surface layer is ice. And then there's a few locations that are really interesting because you have scarps that just expose ice directly in pretty thick packets, about 100 meters. And there's sort of morphological remnants in front of them that you can see that scarp has been retreating back. So that ice is exposed, it's not really stable, and it's just, we don't have a very good sense at this point of the spatial distribution of that. So we see these scarps in a few locations, but we don't really have the information from the current radars to put together the depth of that and its distribution spatially. But a number of different instruments can come together, and different observation sets can come together to map out in the upper meters where you're likely to have subsurface ice. So this is a combined map cut off at 60 north and 60 south, showing that especially in the 30 to 60 degree latitude ranges, there are a number of locations where you can have the chance to get ice in the near subsurface, or in the surface but buried, so kind of glacier deposits that are covered with debris or dust. So these are all target sites when thinking of future landed missions that want to access ice. All of these mid-latitude targets are really appealing. It's much easier to, as I understand it, to land there than at the North Polar layer deposits, for example. And a lot of work has gone into the classification of the different ice morphologies that you can see. And this is really just fascinating, like coming from a terrestrial glaciology perspective. I mean, they're called glacier-like forms because they look like glaciers. And there are a number of features that very, very closely match the morphologies of things that can form on Earth. Lobate termini, surface striations in these lineated valley fill. This is a crater with ice. And so yeah, we're limited to what we can analyze from remote sensing data, but the analog studies have been really important here to try and at least build up different hypotheses for how these landforms could develop. And the mid-latitudes, they form ice because the obliquity varies significantly on Mars. And yeah, we see that in the classification mapping that's been done. The latitude bands between 30 and 60 degrees really cluster these different ice type forms. So there are a number of different ones, the glacier-like forms being smaller scale, topographically constrained kind of ice deposits, the lineated valley fill being more in the low of the topography, and the debris aprons sort of coming off of higher topography but extending out, and also potentially being quite thick, maybe hundreds of meters thick of ice under a debris cover. So there's a lot of these that have been mapped, and again, the characterization has come a long way, but trying to probe deeper into how they evolved, what is their time scale of evolution and climate control and their evolution hasn't been filled in so much detail yet. And here's some perspective views of these. And yeah, just to say again, especially the lobate debris aprons where some radar data has been able to see through them, it does look like a number of these could have significant stores of ice. And the glacier-like forms are smaller, more kilometer scale in width instead of a span of tens or hundreds of kilometers in other cases. And we don't know how much ice remains in them, but there's a chance there is also ice, especially up in these regions, as opposed to closer down towards the terminus of this landform. And some of the questions that we're after are about the basal conditions when these were formed. Wet-based conditions would be really interesting if we could use the morphologies to constrain that piece of history. And in some cases, there's been some really nice work showing the likely connection point there with these esker landforms that would have been past. So they're sediment deposits that would have been beneath previous ice cover that would have been drainage pathways and sort of representing that there was a subglacial water system beneath the previous ice that covered it. This is all hypothesized, but these are pretty distinct landforms, and there's only a couple ways you can form things like this, and they are associated with some of these buried glaciers today. So yeah, I think this is a big question about how widespread were warm-based glacial features, and especially extending back even in the last billion years of Mars history. Yeah, and without a lot of evidence, people have assumed that most of the glaciers have been cold-based and therefore, not very erosive of the landscape, not in contact with a lot of water or having water at the bottom. But I think that this is something that we still have good reason to ask questions about and probe into and see if we can answer more directly in specific sites, at least in specific sites. And Ann Lee, who's here at UW, she's been doing some really nice work trying to evaluate if these alcoves, where a number of these ice deposits more initiate, if they look like cirque basins on Earth morphologically, and if they could be indicative of subglacial erosion, which would imply liquid water. Okay, I'm running a little short, so I'm going to move a little faster here. Just a couple more slides. So I wanted to bring this more full circle, thinking about old ice again and accessing ice on Mars. So in the future exploration of Mars, there is a proposed International Mars Ice Mapper, which would be a radar mission if it flew, and would provide kind of a really nice constraint in the upper tens of meters, especially below the subsurface, where we don't necessarily have good data about the distribution of subsurface ice on Mars. And with sample return in the plan, not from ice samples, but maybe in the farther future, if human missions went to Mars and we're accessing ice as a resource, there could be a scientific component along with that in collecting samples. And so a number of us came together a couple years ago on request from NASA to think about this directly and identify what key science could be addressed with ice core samples from Mars. So kind of we know we need the ice as a resource. What's the science that could be supported if ice samples were collected, and especially if they were brought back to Earth? And this was a really interesting exercise because we were truly able to bring terrestrial expertise and to all aspects of this. So yeah, if you're interested, this is just a white paper, but yeah, there would be different ice to access that would relate to different science objectives. So that was one point we came up with. And the two key questions that stood out would be that we could address if there was extinct or extant life on Mars and what the history of Mars climate and water cycle was. And the ice cores would be really distinct in their ability to help address these questions. And that could be addressed from a continuous core, and we were told it would be possible to drill one to 10 meters, which would be incredible, but even fractures or pieces of core could also be important. So just quickly to show, there's too much here, but there's a number of measurements that could be made. The ones in yellow relate to the question about past life or life in general, and fighting this challenge of decontamination versus resolution and what's actually possible to collect. So yeah, with that, I just kind of want to come to a close. I said most of this, so I'll just get to the last slide saying that I do think there's some really nice avenues for analog science going forward. And personally, it's been really fun to see different parts of my research actually have these overlaps and see that in a longer arc of where that can go, especially thinking from Mars and potential future ice sampling. yeah, and I'm just excited for what's going to come in the future. So with that, I'd be happy to take any questions. Thanks.